Welcome to Princeton University, everybody. Welcome virtually. My name is Sam Wang, and I am a professor of neuroscience and also director of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And I welcome you all to a series that we have started, and this is part of our shutdown series, our coronavirus special, which is a virtual series on fixing bugs in democracy. This is a series that's co-sponsored by the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which I direct, and the Pace Center for Civic Engagement here at Princeton. In case you don't know, the university is, like universities across the nation, are shut down because of the coronavirus epidemic. Therefore, we had this event long planned. At first, we thought we might not do it, but then we realized the show must go on. And so I welcome you all. This event tonight is the first in a series called Fixing Bugs in Democracy. And I encourage you to go read about it at election.princeton.edu/events. And the theme for this Fixing Bugs in Democracy series is the idea that democracy, let's call it Democracy 1.0, is getting a little bit creaky and it's starting to show its age. And there are things that we can and should do about it as a society. And we thought that it would be an opportunity to drill into some of these ideas and talk about the ways in which democracy is showing its age and the ways in which we could fix these bugs the way we might fix bugs in a computer program. And so, as I said, you can go read about it at election.princeton.edu/events. We have, kicking off the series, Ellen Weintraub, a member of the Federal Election Commission and a former chair. In future events, we have Katie Fahey, who started an anti-gerrymandering organization called Voters Not Politicians in Michigan, and also Dave Daly, who is author of a recent book, Unrigged, which is about, again, fixing gerrymandering. And up in the future, we have Jesse Wegman from the New York Times, who has written recently about the Electoral College. So we've got lots and lots of events. And tonight, I'm really honored and pleased to welcome Ellen Weintraub virtually to Princeton University. Ellen, thank you for coming to Princeton to visit us.
Sam, I only wish I could really be there in person.
Yes. Now, let me tell the audience just a little bit about you, and let's just launch in. Commissioner Weintraub is a member of the Federal Election Commission. She has chaired the commission several times. She's now a commissioner, one of 3 out of a maximum of 6 commissioners, so there's currently 3 commissioners. She was appointed to the Federal Election Commission originally on 2002, took office towards the end of that year, and was elected for the first time chair of the commission almost right away in 2003. And she's been on the commission for 18 years.
17.
So, yes?
17.
17 years, yes. Yes, thank you. I'm a science guy, but somehow, as it turns out, arithmetic was actually one of my poorer subjects in school. So let's see. So Commissioner Weintraub has a long history in working in election law and also policy. To just hit some highlights, she went to Yale, majored in British studies, went to Harvard Law School, graduated in the class of '84, and classmates with Loretta Lynch, who former Attorney General. She's worked in litigation at several leading law firms. She was once counsel of the U.S. House of Representatives Ethics Committee and rewrote the House Ethics Manual and assisted in the drafting of the Senate Ethics Manual. And so that's just to give you a sense of the kinds of things she's worked on. She has specialized in political law and all aspects of elections and has applied that to elections. Now, I should pause and say something I've forgotten, which is that if you have questions, you'll have a chance to ask them. I think the best way to ask them is probably to go to Twitter and use the hashtag Fixing Bugs in Democracy. So if you make the # and then type Fixing Bugs in Democracy and type your question, then I'll see them. And also you can send them in through the various other channels that we have available to us, and you can and we will get those questions. So Commissioner Weintraub, there's just so many things I want to ask you in this strange time. And
I just lost the sound.
Integrity and exactly what's going on right now with, maybe with just the present time that we're in right now. So
I'm
trying
not
to, what's that?
hearing you.
Oh dear. Okay, well, I hope my connection will stabilize. Let me just close a few windows here. That is not very technically, it's funny, I'm on campus actually right now. I snuck onto campus to do this. I shouldn't even say that. But I have a question about election integrity, if you can hear me. I'm curious about your thoughts about how we can maintain the integrity of elections, ways to make sure that as many people's vote as possible, and ways to make sure that elections go off without a hitch. And from your perch on the Federal Election Commission, you seem to be at the center of all that, at least to observe what's going on. What do things look like from your point of view, and what are we doing? What should we be doing?
Well, there's two different buckets. I mean, at the Federal Election Commission, what we mostly focus on is campaign finance. So I could talk about issues about money and politics, but I think what's on everybody's mind right now is the mechanics of voting and will people be able to vote? And I personally am very concerned about this. We have a long history of voter turnout that is not actually all that impressive. I mean, in the last election, we had turnout that everybody was very excited about in 2018. It was the highest midterm voter turnout in 100 years, and still
Right.
less than half of the eligible population turned out and voted. So that
One
was—
might want to grade on a curve.
yeah. So that wasn't really great. We usually hit at least the low 60% in a presidential year. But this year, of course, we're going to be facing challenges that we have not confronted before. And Congress has begun to act on this. They've allocated $400 million to the states in order to beef up their electoral systems so that they can confront whatever difficulties they have as a result of the pandemic. However, it's been estimated by the Brennan Center that it would take $2 billion to get the entire country ready and able to vote by mail, which I think a lot of people are going to want to do this year because they're not going to feel comfortable going into a polling place. Now, I don't think that we want to abolish all in-person voting. There are a lot of people for whom in-person voting is really a better option for them. Disabled people, people who have issues where they need assistance, or they live in a place where they don't have a good postal system, for example, on tribal lands. So we don't want to eliminate that possibility for the people who want to take advantage of it. But for other people, if we are still in a situation where people don't feel safe lining up to vote, we are really going to have to beef up our capacity for vote by mail. And the states and localities are going to really have to get going on that right now. They need to order equipment. They need to get the envelopes and the paper and be prepared to explain this system, because there are some people in different states who are very used to voting by mail, and it's the norm. But there are other states where voting by mail is more unusual, and people are going to have to learn how to do it and exactly what's required. And there are going to have to be systems in place to make sure that votes are not needlessly discarded because the signatures don't look like they match up. People are going to need to have the opportunity to come in and contest that if their ballot is put aside. So we need to get all these procedures in place. And I know there are a lot of really great officials working at the state and local level who are already starting on this project, but it is going to be a big project, and it is going to be a full court press to get it all done. And I hope that Congress will allocate more funds for it, because it's going to be expensive.
It seems like with the GDP about to shrink by a projected 8% or so in this calendar year, that there might be need for economic stimulus, and why not put a few $1 billion into making sure our democracy is as strong as possible?
Well, we need to make sure that we are healthy, both physically as for all of our citizens, but also we want to have a healthy democracy. And that means that people actually feel that it is safe to vote. We don't want anyone to feel that in order to cast their vote, they have to risk their physical safety to do so. So this is a key issue, and I think democracy is worth the money.
Now, for vote by mail, it seems that in states that have implemented it, there's reforms like automatic voter registration, vote by mail. These have been observed to increase turnout. Would you say that it's currently the norm that everybody thinks that the most people should vote?
I will only say that I am a strong advocate of having as many citizens vote as possible. As I've said, our turnout in the past has not actually always been impressive. And if there are students listening, Princeton students or other students listening, I got to tell you guys, your generation is not good at voting. You don't turn out, and it's important. It's really important that everyone be represented in their government and that they turn out and vote so that politicians will feel that they need to be accountable to you and to respond to your issues. So it is particularly important, I think, for voters who don't normally turn out to make it that extra effort to turn out so that they can get the kind of government that really they deserve and that they should have a voice in.
All right, great. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the questions that are coming on Twitter. Someone wants to know the website for learning more. You can link, we have materials for about Commissioner Weintraub, and you can go to election.princeton.edu/events to learn about this event and also about future events. So I'm curious about the role of the FEC, and I know that you were on a podcast with me and Julian Zelizer earlier this afternoon, and we got into this a little bit. It seems like the FEC is not in the strongest position right now to enforce. And just to remind people, you all don't have a quorum right now to do things. So I want to hear about that and what it's done to the ongoing work of the men and women at the FEC.
Well, yes, this is not a good situation. We're supposed to have 6 commissioners, no more than 3 of any one political party. And right now we only have 3. And 3 is not a good number because it takes 4 to form a quorum, to hold meetings, to launch investigations, to conclude investigations, to issue penalties, to offer guidance to citizens via the advisory opinion process or broader guidance through rulemakings. All of that requires 4 votes, and we don't have 4 votes right now. So we can't actually do any of those things. And that has been the case since the end of August. We had one commissioner who left the commission 3 years ago and was not replaced. A second commissioner left the commission 2 years ago and was not replaced. And then at the end of last August, a third commissioner left and has also not been replaced. So we are really handicapped in doing our job. Now, fortunately, a lot of the work that gets done at the FEC is done by our excellent staff, and they are all still hard at work. There are investigations that were launched before we lost the quorum that are ongoing, and the important data that all of the candidates file with the FEC that explains where the money's coming from and where the money's going, that's supporting all the candidates and the party committees and the PACs. All of that continues to be collected and analyzed and importantly posted to our website. Our latest reporting deadline was March 20th. And even though there is not a single employee in the building, the entire agency is on mandatory telework. That information was able to be submitted electronically, and our staff was able to get it up on the web and make it available to the public and to the press and to everyone who is interested in that. So there is a lot of good work that is going on by our staff working at home right now, but it is not a good situation that we can't hold a formal meeting and do the really important business that the FEC needs to do.
Now, on the topic of rulemaking, one of the things that you can't do right now, I want to get to our topic today, which is microtargeting. And the question, something that you've talked about a lot, a big signature issue for you is dark money and the ways that things can happen out of sight of the public and in ways that people don't know about. And I wanted to get a little bit into microtargeting because that strikes me as a domain where technology has gotten well ahead of the last time that rules got changed. I'm looking at a statement that you wrote called the Law of Internet Communications Disclaimers, and you issued that statement back in December. And you mentioned that the FEC hasn't been able to revamp the law since 2006. And so where are we at now in terms of internet-based advertising? And what's really the problem with microtargeting?
Okay, so internet-based advertising, the last time the commission did any kind of a rulemaking, and that was probably the first and last time we did any kind of a rulemaking affecting the internet was the rulemaking that we concluded in 2006. It was a great rulemaking for 2006, but the difference between 2006 and 2020 is just eons in internet years. And the way that people have used the internet has really dramatically changed since then. When we did that rulemaking, YouTube was just barely in its infancy, and the entire notion that somebody would place information, advertising, content online for free, and then it could go viral, it could be spread organically, that just wasn't something that was happening in 2006. So none of our rules really took into account the possibility that somebody could spend a lot of money creating content, and yet they wouldn't spend any money to place it because it would just move organically online, or perhaps be promoted in ways that our rules really don't capture. So those rules really require updating. We've been trying to do an update on our rules. It's a very narrow rulemaking on just the disclaimers that go on a very narrow category of ads that are placed on the internet. And believe it or not, we've been working on that since 2011. When we started doing it, nobody was much interested in it. We got 6 or 7 comments back in 2011. And then in 2017, after the 2016 election, and everything that we learned about the content that people were getting online and where it was coming from, some of it coming from Russia, from people who were masquerading as American citizens and really weren't. Suddenly there became a whole lot more interest in where are we getting this information that we are receiving online? Where is it coming from? And is it reliable? Is it credible? Is it trustworthy? So I tried to jumpstart that rulemaking, thinking that this would really give an impetus to it. We got hundreds of thousands of comments. We held a hearing. We got a lot of good information.
And those real comments?
Yeah, real comments.
So they weren't like bot comments?
No. They were real comments from real American citizens who wanted us to conclude this rulemaking and improve our rules and update them to make them relevant to the current era. And sadly, despite working on it again for a couple of years, I could not bring it to closure. I could not get my colleagues to really negotiate over some things that really should be, I thought, no-brainers. We need to have information on the face of the ad. You shouldn't have to go looking for some little icon somewhere and then click on a link and then go to someplace which might still not give you the information about who the actual donors are behind that advertising. We need to make it all a lot more transparent and a lot more open. So that rulemaking was really kind of stalled before we lost the quorum. Now, without a quorum, we can't move it forward at all.
But one of the difficulties here is that even if one got disclosure, it strikes me that when we talk about micro-targeting, there are these other difficulties. Like disclosure will only modestly help me if I see the ad, if I still don't get to see the other people's ads. So here I am in Princeton. If I think about a neighborhood that has pretty different politics from Princeton, it would be parts of Hamilton, which is just a few miles away. Folks in Hamilton are getting different ads. They get information, I get information. It's not the same information. And so it strikes me that that micro-targeting, which you've written about a lot, is pretty concerning because it destroys the public conversation. Instead of having one conversation, somebody in Hamilton's going to get a conversation about guns and somebody else is going to get something about abortion. Somebody over here, there's going to be a very focused thing where maybe, I don't know, people who think that climate change is bad get a message about that. People who don't think climate change is bad might get the opposite message from the same candidate. And so it just strikes me that the very nature of having any kind of public conversation is threatened by it.
I completely agree with that. One of the things that troubles me about micro-targeting is that the internet creates this new way of advertising. Now, there's always been some forms of targeted mail and targeted broadcast advertising, but when an ad is broadcast on television, then everybody who turns on that channel in that area sees the same ad. When something is in the newspaper, everybody who has a subscription to that newspaper gets it. Even the mail that you get is targeted to some degree, but I know because we get complaints that are based on people having received targeted mailings that slipped up and sent it to somebody that wasn't quite as targeted as they thought it was. And then people complain about it and say, I just got this mailer from this person and it looks misleading to me, and are you going to do something about it? It is difficult to target mail as precisely as one can target a digital ad. The platforms collect all this information about us. We're not even paying attention. We are using the internet. We're collecting information. We're clicking on things. We're liking things. We're sharing things. And every time we do that, at. Every time we look at something online, the platforms are just sucking up all this data about us, and using it to sell ads that are just precisely targeted just to that individual. So not only are you not getting the same ad as the person in the house next door, you might not even be getting the same ad as the person sitting across the dining room table from you. It is all very precise, and particularly at a time like this, where we have lost the opportunity to gather around the water cooler and discuss what we've been seeing online and in-person conversations, it is more important than ever that the kind of information that is being spread and shared online be shared broadly enough that there is the opportunity for what in First Amendment jurisprudence is called counter speech. If you don't like what one person is saying, then your First Amendment response is to get out there and make a better argument on the other side. But if you don't know what's being said, if you can't hear those arguments on the other side, if you're not seeing the same data, the same information, the same ads, then you don't even know you're supposed to respond to it. And this kind of divisive advertising that is so precisely tailored, I think also contributes to polarization. It makes people think they're going to get their own tailor-made candidate, and compromises don't have to be made. And politicians are not held accountable for doing exactly what you suggested, which is to say one thing to one person and say the opposite thing to somebody else.
So what would this look like? In your Washington Post piece that you wrote back in December, I'm going to read a sentence here just to get started here. A good rule of thumb could be for internet advertisers to allow targeting no more specific than one political level below the election at which the ad is directed. So let's unpack that a little bit. Like, could there be a rule that did this?
Well, I'm not proposing a government regulation. What I am proposing is that the platforms who take all this information about us, all this data, and monetize it and turn it into advertising, and they do this because of the great country that we live in that has provided them with the resources to develop these high-tech companies and lives off of the free speech principles that are encoded in our conversation and really in our national DNA, that they have an obligation to our democracy. They have an obligation not to undermine our democracy, and they should voluntarily adopt advertising rules for political ads that maybe are different from the way they advertise soap.
Okay, so Facebook, Twitter, Google, you want these guys to just voluntarily regulate themselves and be less granular in their targeting than they could. Is that what that's what you're suggesting?
Yes,
and they're going to do it voluntarily.
The way they sell their ads. And it's not a crazy idea, because Twitter has decided that it is not going to do any political advertising. It's just going to get out of the game.
Twitter.
Google has decided that it is going to do something akin to this. It has said that it will not sell ads at a more granular level than targeting by age, gender, and zip code. Now,
but two of those are not the thing you suggested, and I'm really worried about this now, because they're doing age and gender and zip code, and my interpretation of your idea, which I like, is just go to counties and that's it. But you're saying that they're still going more granular than that.
They are, but they are the closest one to without abandoning the platform for political advertising, which I think is too extreme a solution. They are trying something. It is not, I think, the ideal solution, but I give them credit for trying. Facebook, on the other hand, has said they're not going to do any of this. They're going to just continue with their micro-targeting ads.
Well, if the service is free, then you're the product, right? And so here we are, and our information is the product. We are being sold to advertisers, and 1,000 of people, academics of Asian descent who like to read advertisements about, I don't know, comfortable shoes. This is the thing I read ads for. And so I fit into a target audience, and now what? The Republicans are going to take your comfortable shoes, or something like that.
Well, it's fine if they want to use that sort of information to sell you shoes,
right.
And maybe You might like that. I find all of these targeting ads a little bit creepy personally, and if I could opt out of all of them, I would. It's very hard to negotiate those settings, but if it's a different issue if they're trying to sell you shoes than if they're trying to sell you politics and candidates and governance.
Well,
those things we ought to have a higher bar for.
I mean, earlier today when we were talking with you, Julian Zalazer and I were talking on Politics and Polls, our podcast, it seemed to me that I guess my take on this is that it would be nice if companies did this voluntarily, but then we would not be guaranteed any kind of uniformity. And so I hesitate to sign on to the idea that this should be done voluntarily, because we're just never going to get uniformity. I mean, okay, let's say Facebook sees the light and that happens. What happens with TikTok or Instagram or, you know, Twitch? What about political ads on video game channels? Is each one going to step up? I'm just a little concerned about. I'm suggesting the heavy hand of government to come in and set a rule. That's what I'm suggesting. And
what I'm suggesting is that is not an option right now. And indeed, I think we would have to be really careful, even if we had a quorum and we were capable of coming to a consensus on this. You know, there are First Amendment concerns with the government issuing regulations telling people how they can sell political ads. So I'm not convinced that this Supreme Court would necessarily uphold any such rule that we would adopt.
Because of the First Amendment.
Yeah. Right. Well, their interpretation of the First Amendment.
Right. So let me just, I've got, let's see, we promised to go to questions around 6:30. It's 6:36 p.m. So we started a little late, but I just want to take a question, and this is relevant to your point. But I just want to get into the technology a little bit. This is from Telmo Pereira. Telmo is a graduate student actually here in neuroscience, the institute where I do my research. And Mr. Pereira says, radar tech can detect speeding in highways. Using this allows police to enforce traffic law. Machine learning tech can detect microtargeting in social media. See papers by Jeremy Blackburn, who's a professor at Binghamton Computer Science in New York State. And so because of this machine learning tech for detecting microtargeting, why can't the FEC use that to enforce campaign advertisement regulation? And so he wants to know, seems to him that machine learning can be greatly useful in whatever rules that get issued, if there are rules in the future.
Yes, well, we would need to have the rules first. So, what it sounds like is that he's saying, here's a mechanism that you could use to enforce a rule if you had such a rule. But right now, there is no such rule. So, he's one step ahead of the game at this point.
Are there other rules that the FEC is in the business of enforcing as they stand now that could use machine learning? I mean, is that the kind of thing that's happening at the FEC now?
Well, I think I probably need to hire some more computer scientists from Princeton in order to help us come up with some better ideas for how we could use machine learning to enforce our rules. But no, we are not currently using that technique.
So let's see. So let me just go back here. I want to talk about a little bit about false information. This seems like it's a bit of a problem. And I just wonder who, if anybody, would be in the business of regulating it. And I'm a little pessimistic about the answer, given where we've gone so far. One thing that researchers have reported, this is a study that was in Science Magazine a couple of years ago, researchers have argued that we as consumers tend to respread false statements and fake news more quickly than we spread things that are truthful. And so one question is there some way to fight this river of fake news? And I think specifically, I'm thinking about mechanisms of reporting content that violate standards of integrity. Can you imagine that working out in a way that allows speech, but slows down false statements?
Well, I think what we need is a lot better information about where we're getting this, where this stuff is coming from, and whether it is coming from credible sources. And there are proposals out there, there are groups out there already who are consortiums of journalists who are doing fact checking, who are trying to provide better information to the public about whether the information that they're seeing really is credible and reliable and has been fact checked. There are, unfortunately, fake news sites that try to mock local news organizations, but really they're just set up to promote particular perspective, shall we say, that is, it's not real news. But the problem with having government be involved in determining things like that is that it's a slippery slope. It is, I don't think anybody wants the government to turn into the arbiter of truth. There are countries in the world right now who are taking advantage of the pandemic to assume much greater roles in determining what is true and what is false. And they say, well, we don't want to have false information about the pandemic. So the government is going to pass new laws now and is going to say that if you are spreading disinformation, then you can be fined, you can be imprisoned. And in authoritarian countries, having the government be the arbiter of truth and controlling all of those outlets and being able to point to folks who are criticizing the government and saying what it's saying isn't true, saying we're going to penalize that. We have to be really careful about going down the road of giving that role to the government of deciding what is true and what is false. I think what we need to do is empower our citizens with much better information so that they are in a position to assess for themselves the truth and the falsity of the information that they're seeing online or anywhere else.
It seems that one difficulty of that is the nature of the media culture in the United States. When you talk about this, it makes me think of the system in Norway. I was just a few months ago at the museum before they closed in Washington, D.C. I was a little sad about the museum closing, but not the museum, but the newseum. And one of the things that was pointed out at the museum was that there's a robust fact-checking organization in Norway that I believe is a nonprofit organization. It's separate from the government. People pay money for their, in general, people in Norway are really good at paying for news and paying for media. But this is an independent organization that checks information, and it's called factisk.no, if I remember correctly. And factisk.no just goes around and checks factual information, and it does it in a nonprofit manner. I just wonder, in the United States, what would that look like? It feels like we don't really have a robust nonprofit sector. Our media sector is not terribly healthy at the moment, at least for local news and independent journalism. And so I just am concerned about how we're going to get there. I mean, I'm agreeing with you that that would be a good goal, but I can't quite think how to get there.
Well, I think it is troubling that we are in a place right now where the country has become so polarized, and polarized countries are really ripe targets for disinformation because people are just ready to believe whatever confirms their own biases. And we have become polarized in our politics. We've become polarized in the news sources that we read and that we trust. And it becomes much harder. We don't have something like the BBC, some vast public network that everybody trusts as the independent of the government, but publicly funded, that everyone trusts as a source of reputable news. We don't have that anymore. When I was growing up, there were 3 networks and everybody listened to the same 3 anchor people and believed what they heard. Now, when people listen to a news show and they don't like what they're hearing, they say, well, that's just not true. I know it's not true because I don't want it to be true. And we need to grow up about that. There are facts there is objective truth out there, and truth matters and facts matter.
You would think that NPR would play this role. I mean, approximately speaking, it's in the corresponding position to the BBC.
Well, we just need to boost the signal on that. We need to. There aren't that many people who listen to NPR. I think that's a good example, but it would have to be a much bigger voice in order to play that role.
Here, your point is reinforced by Bob Schwartz, who's here in New Jersey, and Bob writes on Twitter, I agree that micro-targeted misinformation flying under the radar is bad, but he wants to know, what about widely distributed misinformation that's in the radar? And he says, on talk radio and the #1 cable news network, aren't those kinds of misinformation of much, much greater influence, importance, and concern? And I think that he's kind of carefully, as they say in Twitter world, he's subtweeting the name of a network, and he just wants to know about non-factual information that gets out there, and that people trust.
And I think that is I hear that concern, but I also cannot envision in this country empowering a government agency to take down a cable news network and say, you're just not you're not reliable, so you don't get to speak.
Well, the thing is, we do see like little examples of that. So, for example, these daily public hearings about coronavirus that we've been hearing from the President of the United States, in conjunction with other experts like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. So these are people who have expertise. And there was something unusual that happened on CNN the other day, which is that they cut to the part with the experts, and they left out the part involving the President of the United States. And I was intrigued by that, because as far as I can tell, speaking as a scientist, those experts are saying things that are true. And the President's a layman and he says what he thinks. And a lot of what he thinks is not technically speaking true about the coronavirus epidemic. And so I was curious about that. They're a private business, CNN, and they're able to do that. And so that was interesting to me, that they thought that the public health, I don't know, I'm curious about the editorial decision that went into doing that. Are they, maybe they would air the President's remarks later, maybe they put it on a delay. I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of putting something on a tape delay. When something's false, then broadcast that later and keep the true stuff on the air. And I recognize that I'm getting tiptoeing right up to the edge of the First Amendment issue, and then I'm like falling into the water.
Well, I don't regulate networks, so
Yeah.
You're wandering out of my field of expertise.
Look, I'm curious, back to the FEC. You've got 3 members out of 6, and for quorum you need 4.
Yes.
Is there any hope that the FEC would get one more commissioner to meet quorum in time for the general election? Because it strikes me that this is a pretty important time to have a functioning FEC.
I think there is a hope that would happen. I mean, there was a nominee. One person has been nominated, which would bring us up to 4, and that person had a hearing, and then the world sort of turned on its head, and everyone was consumed by one incredibly important thing that they had to do, and that was grapple with this international pandemic. So, we thought that it looked to me like it was heading towards confirmation of this 4th commissioner, but it got sidetracked, left in the dust because of the all-consuming need to deal with coronavirus, which I respect and agree with, that had to be the top priority. Now the Senate has gone into recess until April 20th, so we're definitely not going to get a vote on that nominee until at least late April. I am hoping that at some point we will get back up to 4, but it's not going to solve all of our problems. We will be able to get some stuff done with 4 commissioners, but
So you could get a 4th commissioner by the end of April, maybe.
Theoretically, yes.
I mean, in principle, if we follow the hearing schedules or what have you.
Yes, it could happen. And I expect it will happen sometime this year before the election. I don't have any special inside knowledge on that. That's just my assumption that at some point they will get around to confirming a 4th person. But that the problem is that the FEC, like much of Washington and perhaps much of the country, has become so polarized on ideological grounds that just getting a 4th commissioner is not going to solve our problems. I cannot promise that just because we have 4 commissioners that we will be able to conclude rulemakings, that we'll be able to come together and make decisions, because the unfortunately, campaign finance issues have become very, very partisan, and the views of Republicans on campaign finance and the views of Democrats on campaign finance, particularly on the FEC, have become really so far apart that it is difficult, and I'm not sensing much interest even on the other side in trying to find common ground, in trying to come together and come to some kind of consensus position. There's been a huge uptick in split votes on the FEC really since 2008. And we have not been doing, in my view, an effective enough job of enforcing the laws that we already have on the books, no less writing any new rules.
I have a comment here from a Twitter listener and viewer, Douglas Whitmore, who wants to know, and I think that maybe I'll let you answer this one. He says, isn't the FEC supposed to be unconditionally nonpartisan? And I think I want to hear you talk about that particular point.
Well, it is supposed to be bipartisan. It was never designed to be nonpartisan. It is supposed to be bipartisan. And there is something to the view that it was not a crazy perspective of the folks that wrote the law back in the 1970s to think that they did not want decisions of the Federal Election Commission to be made on a partisan basis. They didn't want one party to control with a majority vote, the apparatus of the FEC, and to be able to penalize their political opponents as a result of that. In order to have a body that could say, every decision we make is bipartisan, and you can't just say, the only reason that I'm being investigated is for partisan reasons, that I think is part of what could make the FEC into a credible agency if commissioners were willing to work together to try to find solutions, which they used to do. For most of the time that the FEC has been in existence, commissioners worked hard to forge compromises in order to reach 4 votes, in order to come to conclusions. But starting in 2008, we have lost that sense that it is the mission of the FEC to find those kinds of compromises, because half the commission believes that the entire campaign finance jurisprudence is contrary to their view of the First Amendment, and therefore they're not really interested in compromising. They would rather just vote together, vote no, and then the investigations don't start and the law doesn't get enforced.
I want to get into the weeds a little bit here. So currently the 3 sitting members of the commission are 2 appointees of Democrat on the Democratic side,
right,
and 1 Republican appointee.
Right.
And the one who's waiting in the wings, should that person be confirmed, would be a 2nd Republican appointee. So then we've got 2 and 2. Appointees come from the President of the United States, is that right?
Yes.
And so that means that the president would, I think you were telling me earlier that by convention, the president will typically put up 1 Democrat and 1 Republican.
And the president will pick the person of his party, and the leaders in the Senate of the opposition party will pick the person of the other party, will recommend that person to the president. That's how I got appointed. I'm a Democrat. I was appointed by a Republican president, but I was recommended for the position by the Democratic leader of the Senate.
I see. So for instance, should there at some point in the future be a Democratic president, then that president would put up a Democrat of his staff's choosing, and then Senate Republicans would come up with the Republican nominee.
That's the convention. That is the way it has worked so far. And
so Mitch McConnell presumably would have a pretty strong say in exactly who got appointed then.
Well, yes. Now, it has been proposed that we should try and separate the appointment of people who regulate people in Congress from the people in Congress, that a blue ribbon commission should be set up of distinguished persons who are not members of Congress, and that they should recommend to the president, say 3 names and say, and encourage the president to pick from amongst the people that they have chosen and vetted, so that it's an unusual situation where the people who are being regulated, that is the politicians, get to choose the people who are going to regulate them. And perhaps not an optimal situation for getting strong regulation. So I think that would be a better system. It would provide, then it's sort of kicking the can down the road, because probably the same politicians would be involved in picking the members of the Blue Ribbon Commission, but at least you would have one level of separation between.
At least it would be indirect.
Yes, it would be at least indirect. I think it would help.
Yeah. So let's see. So I'm looking at a question here from a viewer. Let's see. I'm just going to. There's sort of a little backlog here, so let me just pick one here. So Aaron, who's viewing, and I want to let him. I'm going to read it to you and you interpret it, because I'm having a little trouble understanding it. The question is it still viable for quid pro quo corruption, or the appearance thereof, to act as the main compelling interest for campaign finance regulation? And he wants to know, can or should a new compelling interest arise in the wake of micro-targeting?
Well, I think that the Supreme Court has really narrowed the definition of corruption that they are allowing us to take into account. And that, I think, is a problem, because I think that there is something beyond quid pro quo corruption that most people in the country recognize as corrupting and bad for our democracy. So the current system right now, the jurisprudence says, and this has been true since 1976, that there is an inherent risk of corruption in unlimited contributions that are that go straight to the candidates. And that's why it is constitutional and consistent with the First Amendment for us to have contribution limits on how much candidates and party committees can accept. However, since 2010, with the Citizens United decision and its progeny in the courts, in some of the lower courts, it is the court has said that you can have these super PACs, okay? Because the Supreme Court has said that it cannot be corrupting to provide any amount of money to an entity that is independent of the candidates. Now, we could debate whether some of these super PACs are truly independent of the candidates that they're supporting, but even taking that on its face, even assuming that these outside spending groups were truly independent of the candidates, is it really true that it is corrupting to give $3,000 directly to a candidate? The contribution limit right now is $2,800, but there is no way that anyone could be corrupted by a $3 million contribution to a super PAC that is doing nothing but supporting the very same candidate. See, now you laugh. I don't think that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't seem to make sense to you. I don't think it makes sense to most people in America. So I think that we really need a rethinking of our jurisprudence in this area. I'm not anticipating it's going to happen anytime soon, but I think that is indeed what would be required. Going back to, again, the Buckley decision in 1976, the court said that leveling the playing field is antithetical to their notion of the First Amendment. Think about that. In what other competition that we hold in any other sphere do we say we don't want a level playing field? It is okay to have one side be incredibly advantaged over the other side, to have so much money that they can drown out the message on the other side. And we somehow think that this is going to contribute to a robust and open debate that will allow the American citizens to compare different points of view and come to their own conclusions about which is the better point of view and what kind of policies they want to see adopted. I don't really agree with this notion that political equality has no place in our money and politics system. And I think most Americans actually agree with that and would rather see a stronger notion of political equality embodied in our constitutional jurisprudence.
I want to broaden this out a little bit. Just let's get away. I want to get, just in the last few minutes, I want to get a little bit away from our focus on campaign finance. I mean, I think that's right in the middle of your responsibilities as commissioner. But I want to see if I can get you to go outside that just a little further out and talk a little bit about what could happen. Let me think about this for a moment. So we are in what I would call a second Gilded Age, where there seem to be great interests, moneyed interests, the way you're talking, you're talking about the influence of money in politics. And these great interests seem to have a lot of influence in politics today. And it's reminiscent of things that I've read about the Gilded Age back in the 1880s and 1890s. And it just seems like the same kinds of problems. And now we're looking to the Supreme Court to maybe broaden its views. That's kind of an idealistic wish that they would perhaps be really interested in cleaning up these things. Let's make a wish list. And I just want to hear you talk about some wishes that you might like to see, let's say in the next 10, 20 years. Let's make, not this fall, 10, 20 years. Julian was saying earlier today that the last time political campaigns, or rather campaign finance in the United States and political campaigning went through a big wave of regulation in the United States was 1974. And at that time, the big topic was money. Is that right? I do not remember that wave of reform, but I guess that was all triggered by the Watergate scandal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was all about money. Is that the last time we really looked at all these issues?
Well, the McCain-Feingold law in 2002.
Which has been gutted.
Pretty much, except for the disclosure provisions.
Right. But the thing is, but like the Citizens United decision, for instance, played a significant role there. I have to I have to needle you just a little bit. You worked at a litigation associate at Cahill, Gordon, and Reindel, which is a pretty elite firm. And Floyd Abrams
Yeah.
who is a principal there,
Yeah.
did a very good job of challenging McCain-Feingold, argued it in front of the Supreme Court, and won.
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, when I got out of law school, that is one of the reasons I went to that firm, was in hopes of working with Floyd because of his First Amendment stature. And I didn't end up doing a lot of work with Floyd. And then I subsequently left the firm and went on and had a whole other career, and ran into him on the steps of I don't remember whether it was the Supreme Court or the DC Circuit Court once, when he was suing my agency. I mean, basically he was suing me, since I'm one of the principals there. I was teasing him. I said, you know, don't you wish now that you had taken me under your wing back when I was an impressionable young associate, and you could have imbued your notion of the First Amendment into me, and then when I got to the FEC, I would be representing your point of view instead of the opposite point of view. Oh, and we had a nice laugh about that. But yeah, and then, you know, I started out at his law firm, and then he ended up suing me and he represented Mitch McConnell in the McConnell litigation.
Let me come back. So I was hoping to get a wish list out of you, and I wanted to, like, I'm going to give you a lightning round of things that appear to be wrong in the American political system, and asking what's the right route for fixing them, whether it's the FEC, congressional, you know, a statute by Congress, or maybe, I don't know, like waving a wand over the Supreme Court. And I'm going to start with a question from Dylan Shapiro, who is, let's see, from Georgia. He's a field organizer and he's a legislative director down there. He is he's actually also an undergraduate here at Princeton. He's class of 23. Wait, did that make him freshman at Princeton? How is a freshman state legislative director? Okay, great. Dylan, you're great. So here's Dylan's question.
Multitasker.
You know, it's a good question, though. I have to say, I'm going to just read his question. I'm going to not take responsibility for it. Commissioner Weintraub, given the Supreme Court's rulings in Buckley, which we were just talking about, and Citizens United, are there any campaign finance reforms short of a constitutional amendment or a sudden shift in the Supreme Court that would have real teeth? Are we limited to ineffective tweaks?
Well, I guess it depends on what you call ineffective. I think we really could bolster our disclosure regime and give people better information about who's behind the money. That would be constitutional. The court has upheld in very strong terms disclosure laws all the way. And in fact, just recently, they had an opportunity to look at another disclosure law and turned it down, which I was very grateful for. I thought that's what they were going to do, but it would have been really bad if they had taken cert on that case, because they could have really done some harm there to our disclosure system. So we could bolster that. We could adopt stronger laws to make sure that we are really not getting foreign money into our elections. That would be upheld as constitutional, I believe. The court has been very concerned about that, about the risk of foreign interference and foreigners trying to insert themselves into our body politic. So I think that that is an area that could pass constitutional muster.
You think there'd be consensus for that in Congress?
You would think. You would think, although I have to tell you, I tried to get a rulemaking started at the FEC and talking about trying to block foreign money in politics. And I went at it every which way. And then I finally thought that I had come up with something that nobody could disagree with. I said, how about if we just look at domestic subsidiaries that are wholly owned by foreign governments who have incorporated companies in the United States, but they are wholly owned by a foreign government. Could we start a rulemaking to see whether we think those companies really should be spending in US elections? And I thought that was a no-brainer, but I couldn't get 4 votes to start that rulemaking. So,
what year was that happened?
No, just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think we might need to get past the current situation where foreign interference has been the subject of basically current politics and in fact, an impeachment inquiry, more or less. And so we're in a situation where that's a third rail at the moment, at least for one of the major parties, I think.
You may be right, although it is disheartening to think that we could not agree as on a bipartisan basis as a nation that we really don't want foreign interference in our elections, and that we could not as come together in order to strengthen our laws to make sure that that doesn't happen. We have not, Congress has not even been able to adopt strong deterrence measures. Just there are bipartisan bills in Congress to the Deter Act, for example, which has, I think it's co-sponsored by Marco Rubio and Chris Van Hollen, and would impose really strong sanctions on any foreign government that tried to intervene in our election. And that sort of deterrence measure is really important, because I am worried that whatever happened in 2016, and our intelligence community has warned us that they are expecting more attempts at foreign intervention in 2020 from the Russians, from the Iranians, from the Chinese, you name it. If we really want to go at that, then we have to convey in no uncertain terms to those foreign governments that there are going to be real consequences if they do that. So that is the kind of legislation that already has bipartisan support and really should be able to get passed in Congress.
That's more along the lines of the NSA or the counterintelligence community. I mean, those are really entities that can perhaps play a direct role in fixing that kind of problem. The deep state.
Well, they certainly can play a role, and I hope are playing a role, but I think we also need stronger laws. Okay,
so here's just my little laundry list that I'm developing, looking at people asking on Twitter, and also things emerging from the recesses of my own mind. The use of private information for microtargeting, is that a thing that the FEC can regulate, or is it something that, say, what's the route to preventing the use of private information?
Well, I think that Congress could probably pass a law on that. I mean, for one thing, I think people really need to regain ownership of their own data, of their own information. Make the platforms at least pay for it.
Europe has a law like that.
Mm-hmm.
The European Union has a law like that.
Yes.
I know that when it went into effect, suddenly many websites that I go to suddenly became quite solicitous of my private information. And these are not websites that I thought of as really caring about me. It was sort of touching. What about now? A lot of this is focused on Democrats and Republicans. Let's drill into that just a tiny bit. Because of our major party system, where it is a tendency in first past the post systems to have two major parties because coalitions form. No, we haven't really talked about minor parties and independents. Is there a way to imagine giving a greater voice or creating a playing field that's helpful for those communities, for people who are, let's say, unwilling to join forces with either major party?
Well, I think, some parties have tried that, and it's a heavy lift in this country for minor parties to get off the ground.
Yeah.
Because the two major parties are so well entrenched. I will say that this has come up in the debate context at the FEC, and some people have suggested that the debate rules have made it harder for minor party candidates to get on the debate stage. And I supported doing a rulemaking on that to see whether maybe we ought to change the rules on that. But again, we couldn't get 4 votes on that one either.
Right. And now I'm going to go way outside your domain and talk about a thing that happened when I was a kid. I was in high school. Don't worry, it's not about like the prom or anything like that. When I was in high school, maybe I was in college. I don't remember, but I remember it must have been later. But I remember reading about this obscure thing. I was looking on the inside pages of either the New York Times or some other paper, and I ran across this article about doing away with this obscure thing called the fairness doctrine. And I remember reading that story and thinking, that seems like a big deal. So you mean to say that this whole business about opposing views being given equal time, that doesn't need to happen anymore? Is there some environment in which one could imagine a version of that making a comeback in any way, given everything you've said about free speech, the Supreme Court, and so on? Is there some path to coming back towards that idea of getting back to your phrase, leveling the playing field?
And political equality.
And political equality.
That is FCC law. That's the communications law. So that is, again, a little bit out of my bailiwick, but I think that it is, you are correct that it is infused with the same kinds of principles that the Supreme Court has so far rejected. in terms of wanting to level the playing field, wanting political equality. You know, it's interesting. We live in a country where supposedly it's one person, one vote. We're all supposed to be equal citizens under the law, but there are a lot of ways in which some people are more equal than others.
I have to say, getting back to the Gilded Age, one thing that was difficult back at that time was that reforms were proposed during the Progressive Era, things like the Sherman Antitrust Act. And those laws really had difficulty getting traction because there was a Supreme Court that was pretty hostile to things like regulating the trusts. And as far as I can tell, my reading of that, and you know, like, look, I'm a science geek, and so I have to be careful. You're a lawyer, I'm a science geek, so I'm just going to give my version of it. For several decades, it was really tough for a lot of reforms to really get any kind of traction because of a Supreme Court that was pretty hostile to interpreting those laws, whether it be, I don't know, the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments, whether it be antitrust, the Antitrust Act. It feels like that even if there were a groundswell of popular support for reform, and it seems like there is for many of the things you're talking about, we're talking about a several decade gap between where people are thinking now, where the kinds of things you and I are talking about, and seeing those things withstand challenge. So are we, not to get on too much of a pessimistic note, but it seems like it might be a little while before we can see really good movement on some of these things.
Well, I don't like to give up hope. I think that Supreme Court, even Supreme Court justices read the newspapers, and you know, they don't necessarily read the same newspapers I read, but I think they read some of the same news that I read. And I think that they can be susceptible to the mood swings of the country. And, you know, I don't give up on the courts. I don't give up on the possibility of justice. I think, you know, we have to believe in that, because, you know, otherwise where is our country headed? I think that it is possible for people to change, and it is possible for people in this country to convey to their leaders that these are not their values, and they want a better country. They want a more equal country. They want a country where everybody really has a fair shot, not only at succeeding in life, but at getting there, you know, even at getting elected. And I think that we are seeing interesting and innovative ideas. I'm going to bring this back to the campaign finance context, because that's my thing. We have seen cities and states experimenting with different ways of campaign financing. We've seen the multiple match public funding system in New York City, which seems to work really well there. We've seen the democracy voucher program in Seattle, which is a really interesting way of empowering every single citizen, because every citizen gets, a voting age gets 4 $25 vouchers that they can give out to candidates for municipal office, and it completely changes the incentives. Whereas before, the candidates would only have incentives to talk to either people who could give them money or people who could give them votes. Now everybody's got something of value that would provide an incentive to go into every single neighborhood and hear the concerns of every single citizen. And I also think that if more people voted, people in Congress would really stand up and take notice if there was an outpouring of citizens who really demanded accountability from their leaders.
What I'm hearing is a resurgence of Federalist principles, where, as the dean of the Yale Law School, Heather Gerken, has said, basically a progressive, like, you know, not your, what does she say? Not your grandmother's federalism, where the idea is that federalism is a tool for making experiments, for trying out different kinds of democracy reforms at all different levels, where we naturally, I think people of a progressive point of view, look to the federal government, look to the federal courts for help, but maybe one should start looking locally, to states, to localities, to cities, in the example that you've given. That maybe that would be a route towards achieving some kind of reform, to get away from, you know, the Supreme Court, who's supposed to be your protective father, who's going to keep you safe and take care of you. It turns out that the Supreme Court in this domain might be your flaky stepdad. And so,
well, And I would encourage, particularly if, assuming that our audience is largely comprised of Princetonians, you know, all of those smart, young, energetic, ambitious people should, I would encourage every single one of them to think about how they can make a difference in their community, in their country, in their world, to think about careers in public service and in helping professions that would really make a difference in the world. They have so much to offer. And as somebody who has spent the better part of my career in public service, I guarantee you not a single one of you will regret it if you make those kinds of choices.
I think those are admirable words. And I think that in this current time, it's contingent on all of us to do more than we thought we were going to do, to help our neighbors, to help our communities. I can tell you that I've been obsessed with things happening in New Jersey over the last few years, and during this coronavirus outbreak, even more than ever. So I really appreciate hearing you say that. Well, Commissioner Weintraub, thank you so much for joining us. I think I hope we haven't worn you out too much. I'm curious if you have any more thoughts, anything more that you want to say. I feel that you've really kind of given us a good schooling in many of these issues.
My final thought is just to reiterate, don't forget to vote. I heard this, this is something that I found on the internet, and sometimes you can find valuable things on the internet. Voting is not like marriage, it's public transport. You don't have to be in love with the candidate. You don't have to feel that you have an eternal bond with that person. You're trying to get to a destination. And so you take the bus that's going to get you as close as possible to where you want to go. And if you can't find a bus that's taking you exactly where you want to go, you get as close as possible. You don't go in the opposite direction, and you don't just stay home, except for right now when everybody should stay home and stay safe.
Yeah, right now we should stay home. But right, but the voting gets you towards something a little bit more perfect.
Yes.
And not perfect, but more perfect.
Yes, we should constantly be striving for that more perfect union.
All right. Well, Commissioner Weintraub, thank you so much for joining us for our virtual town hall. It's been really such a pleasure to have you here to Princeton. And when things are better, I would be delighted to have you down and have you meet some of.
Well, I'd be delighted to come.
We can take you over to Agricola or to Mistral for a drink or what have you.
That'd be great. I'd love to come.
All right. So thank you everyone for coming out. It's a lovely evening. So you've been sitting in front of a computer terminal or a television watching us. I really appreciate that. I want to thank Jason Rode for making this possible, Meg Rooney for co-sponsoring this over at the Pace Center for Civic Engagement here at Princeton, Dave Hopkins for doing technical over at the Media Center. All these people made it possible. And I just want to let you all know that you've been watching the first installment of Fixing Bugs in Democracy, a project co-sponsored by the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which I had, and the Pace Center for Civic Engagement. We're also getting input from the program in Law and Public Affairs. If you want to know more about future events in this series, then please, I welcome everyone to read more about us at election.princeton.edu/events. That's election.princeton.edu/events. Thanks very much, and everybody.